And I think that Congress should pay particular attention to making sure that these human trafficking prosecution units are well funded and can work in coalition at the state and local and federal level law enforcement to integrate the solutions to those problems. You also mentioned the public-private partnership piece.
I did, and that was my next question, so thank you for anticipating it, so that I don't have to cut into the chairman's time now that he's re-entered the room. Maybe you could speak to the importance of that, each of you. I know, Mr. Kutcher, you mentioned it in your testimony as well. IPATH is the Indiana State Report on Human Trafficking, and the entity it created to help fight this scourge in our own state. It's a not-for-profit initiative. There are over 75 organizations statewide focused on collectively addressing this issue, and perhaps you could speak to the importance of these sorts of public-private partnerships in addressing modern slavery, each of you. Thank you.
Sure. Just to touch on the point that Elise was making, I think another thing that shouldn't be lost is the focus on demand prosecution in the space. These are victims. You said it yourself, that these kids are 12 years old, 13 years old. Yeah. That's not a criminal, that's a victim of a crime. And if we're not prosecuting the buyers, if we're not prosecuting the traffickers, not just for trafficking, but that's statutory rape. And it should be treated as statutory rape and prosecuted as rape. And I don't think that we do a good enough job yet of addressing that issue in that way.
Do either of you have thoughts on what we might do to bring more of these individuals to justice, to prosecute them? Well,
it's my understanding that there's an initiative underway currently that will address this within the judiciary system, and I think that the best thing that we can do is to support that initiative.
Continue to support that. Yeah.
I think also making sure that these safe harbor provisions that have had so much bipartisan support here in Congress that would protect, treat victims like victims are very, very important. The public-private partnership aspect of this, I think, is absolutely key. You know, there's a lot that government can do and should be doing, that all governments globally should be doing and collaborating together on this. But as Ashton pointed out, the supply chain issue, the pipeline into slavery, we have to be looking at that. And so I would say the public, there should be kind of 3 Ps in this public-private partnership. It should be also the private sector companies, American companies in particular. You know, when I talk about American leadership on this issue, I don't just mean the American government. I mean all of us. And in many places in the world, American companies are the American brand. So making sure that we enlist those companies, especially now that you all have passed legislation that amends the Tariff Act, which for decades allowed for this importation of child-made and slave-made labor through this consumptive demand loophole that was in existence. You have closed that loophole down, and that is a potentially transformational thing in the world of human trafficking. Now we have to make sure that it's enforced, that the Department of Homeland Security enforces it, that companies understand what they need to do. And most companies don't want anything to do with slavery, but many of them don't understand what they need to do to look at their supply chains and make sure that there's no forced labor in there or no child labor. So we have to come together to talk about that. And one of the things that you all could do, a report was due to you from the Department of Homeland Security, I think back in August, on how they're implementing this very important new provision that you passed, and it hasn't been submitted yet. So I would urge you to ask for that, and we would love to come in and talk with you about it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your ideas and again for your counsel on this, and we'll continue to stay vigilant, even when the Klieg lights are off, and that's really the important thing with respect to our oversight role. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming back and filling in that way. I very much appreciate it. I've had two experiences, I guess, that had a big impact on me. One was hearing the statement of someone in the audience, Louis Giglio, speaking to his congregation saying, "If not you, who?" And I think we all know what that means, and you know, we together who hear that message need to be the people who involve ourselves in any of this. The other was experiencing a group of about 20 young ladies in the Philippines, going to the police department there, seeing what a U.S. private entity was doing to teach them about prosecution. Seeing how this is a crime of opportunity. Most people think this is largely the mafia, and they definitely are involved, but it's really, as you both know, a lot of small business people that take advantage. They have dominion over people, and they use this to make money. But part of our efforts, and we need to measure this, and we need to end it, and that needs to be our focus, part of the effort also has to do with what we do with victims after they've been victimized. And one of the efforts that to me was so impressive was seeing how these young ladies who maybe were 13 or 15, and maybe they were in the rural part of the Philippines, and maybe a gentleman came by and said, "Hey, how would you like to go to Manila for the day?" And they find themselves in Malaysia in a brothel for 7 or 8 years, or they find themselves in a place that they cannot get out of. But they also have to have a place to go. They have to have a place to be protected from people who otherwise would kill them for testifying against them. They've got to have a way of coming back into society. Could you speak to personal experiences there and what we need to do as a nation working with others to address that component also?
Sure. This is the pipeline out. There are 4 or 5 organizations domestically that I think are doing extraordinary work. There's an organization called My Life, My Choice, Journey Out, Courtney's House, Rebecca Bender Initiative, and GEMS. I've had the privilege to spend some time with GEMS and look at the organization and sort of assess the effectiveness of it. They do extraordinary work. They recognize these victims as victims. They do the best they can to rehabilitate them. I think one of the things that we can definitely do is look across that sector of NGOs and find the ones that are the most effective, and then try to assess what the best practices of each one of those individual organizations are, and then replicate that and grow it. You know, as you said, as I said, I think there has to be accountability in our spending relative to this, but there are some simple low-hanging opportunities within these organizations that I actually think the private sector can come in and be drastically supportive. I mean, the administration roles within these organizations are being done a lot of times on these kinds of books. And I think that there's enterprise software that they could be given away for free by many private companies, and that could create massive efficiencies inside of these organizations. But at the end of the day, you have to have a place to keep these people. You know, I was in Russia, and the girls that were getting let out of the orphanages all get let out at about the same age, and the traffickers would circle the orphanages waiting for those girls to hit that prime age where they could use them. So if people don't have a place to go, if they don't have an environment of love and support, and then the expertise to help them with the mental health issue of the abuse that they've endured, they don't get better. And so I think mental health is a gigantic issue in this country in a lot of ways. And I think that we need to really look at this not only as a slavery issue, but as a mental health issue, and ensure that that the finances and the support is going into that arena as such.
This is a problem globally as well. It's very similar. We have worked closely with many Yazidi women. We gave our Human Rights Award last year to a Yazidi woman activist she and her husband are rescuing women from who've been abducted and are being held in sexual slavery by ISIS. And these women are so traumatized. They're now barred from coming here under this order, but they have said, if you can't save us from this, then just bomb us, because we can't survive this. And, one of the things that I think the United States could be doing there, they need mental health services desperately, even if they can't come here to get them. And I think there's more that we could be doing to fund organizations that can provide those kinds of services to women who have suffered just unspeakable horror. Many of them are children.
Thank you. Senator Menendez is back, and he was the lead other sponsor of this legislation, and has been my friend and certainly an advocate for victims and human rights. So I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd ask to submit into the record Human Rights First's blueprint for Congress, how to dismantle the business of human trafficking.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me say that my experience in the Senate, I was speaking to Senator Young yesterday about the difference between the House and the Senate, where we've both have served, is the fundamental difference is that one senator committed to an idea or an ideal and willing to fight for it can create change. You did that in the context of human trafficking. You made it a singular issue. You were focused on it like a laser beam. I'm glad to have worked with you on it, but clearly you deserve the credit, and it's the embodiment of what you can do in the Senate when you choose to do so. I want to salute you on that. I've listened to both of your testimony with great interest, and we're having a major caucus on Russia right now, but this is important. I have questions for both of you, and I hope to get through it in my time. Maybe the chairman will be a little generous with the time.
Take as much time as you wish.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. I won't do that, but I do have some questions. Ms. Massimino, as you know, there have been serious questions both on the Foreign Relations Committee and civil society organizations regarding the integrity of the past 2 years Trafficking in Persons report. To me, that report is the gold standard, and I want to show why it's so important. Mr. Kutcher said the reports are important, but what do we do with them? He's right. But reports begin a template for how we judge countries in the world. The amendment that I got into law, which now denies a country who is in Tier 3 of trafficking any preferential access to the United States in terms of any trade agreement, is incredibly important, a powerful tool, but of course we need the right type of reporting to ensure that those who are in that category don't get arbitrarily and capriciously removed from that category unless they've done the things that are necessary to, in fact, be removed from it, which would be good for the victims of trafficking in their countries, because that means they will have improved their standards. Now, I introduced legislation, bipartisan legislation, with Senator Rubio and Senator Kaine and Senator Gardner that makes sweeping reforms to restore the integrity to the Trafficking in Persons ranking process. I know and I believe there is bipartisan consensus that reforming the ranking process is a priority that we should address early in this Congress. Can you speak to, number one, your organization's reactions to the 2015-16 TIP report, and what damage, if any, do you think that created, and to the importance of the integrity of the TIP report as a foundational issue for us globally to challenge countries in the world to do what we think they should be doing to end modern-day slavery?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you very much for your leadership on that legislation and on the TIP report. Human Rights First has focused a lot of attention over many years on reports coming out of the State Department that have been mandated by Congress, and why it's important for those reports to be basically just the facts, not colored by political considerations. For many years, the State Department country reports annually, we did a critique of those because we felt that there was too much political influence going in across, administrations from different parties, but there was too much political influence and other concerns going into kind of shading the facts in those reports. So we've been very vigilant about, and I think we stopped doing that critique because we felt that the State Department country reports had improved significantly and were much more objective. The point of reports like that is really to provide a baseline for policy. They're not policy, but they're to provide a baseline for policy. And that's why it's so important that reports like the State Department country report and the TIP report are just the facts, really have, and have integrity. So we were very concerned, as many were, that there appeared to be movements of some countries up on the scale without any demonstration or transparency about what the reasons were for that. And the TIP report has actually been a really important tool for diplomats and others to use. And we have instances where countries, have really been pressured to actually improve their performance as a result of the ranking process. So it's really important to have transparency about how those rankings are made, and to make sure that countries don't get a free pass just because we have other business to do with them.
Yeah, and that's a concern.
Yeah, and
This is either as important as this committee has dictated in a bipartisan way, which means that you cannot subvert its importance because you have economic reasons with a country, maybe to some degree even security reasons with a country. Because when you do that, then you undermine the essence of the importance and the integrity of trying to end human slavery. In that regard, my legislation requires TIP rankings to be contingent on concrete actions taken by a country in the preceding reporting period, and that the State Department must specify how these actions, or lack thereof, justify the ranking. A recent GAO study highlighted this as a major gap in the existing TIP ranking process. Would you support such changes?
yes, we would.
Mr. Kutcher, let me ask you, extraordinary work, and I heard it just before I had to leave to go vote, your answer to the chairman about having the freedom to go big and take a risk to develop the technology that might be the next cutting edge on how we further help law enforcement and other entities both capture those, reclaim those lives that have been lost to human trafficking, capture those who were the traffickers themselves, prevent efforts on trafficking. So how is it that if you could, I sit in another committee here on the Finance Committee, and which deals with all tax, trade, and incentives. If there was a way to incentivize that effort by you and others similarly situated, is there a specific way beyond letting you go big? Are there tax incentives? Are there? I think about already the systems you have, and I think about other countries. Maybe one of the requirements we should have is that other countries should use the best available technology at the time, something that we do not have a requirement to in an estimation as to whether they are moving in the right direction on human trafficking. Can you help me a little bit on that, on how we take what you've done and create a greater opportunity for its deployment?
Yeah, I think at its core, the reason why most of our partners, private company partners in the space are technology companies, is that they're naturally incentivized to actually do something about this. So for the most part, there's a CDA 230 that these companies want to perform, or they want their tool to be used in the right way, right? And they don't want their tool to be regulated because then it regulates the potential of the tool for good. And I happen to support that notion that it is the user that is the malicious actor. But in order for these companies to maintain that stance, it is my belief that they have to support efforts in technology to actually grow tools that fight against these types of atrocities that are happening on their platforms. And so therefore, we've had extraordinarily willing participants in that effort. I think we've also launched a best practices guide for companies relative to trafficking, because I think that when your employees are involved in this space, or your company in some way, shape, or form touches this space, I think it actually affects the quality of your company and the performance of your company in the long term. And so I think having companies become aware of these best practice guides, but I think there's also a larger issue relative to what we call modern slavery. And I think it's actually just in the nomenclature of calling it modern slavery. It's slavery. It's just slavery. It's actually, I think we do a disservice to the people that were slaves in this country for so long, and the oppression that they felt in the years following, by not calling it what it is. And if we just call it slavery from a nomenclature perspective, and acknowledge the fact that just because a person is of a different nationality, or that they're being sold for sex, makes it something different, so that we can pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we abolished this and we've already done all that we can. I think that will have a giant impact, because I think it motivates people emotionally to actually build things. On the other side, I think that these tools are best built in the private sector. And the reason why I think that they're best built in the private sector is we're willing to take those risks. And we're willing to create that accountability. Now, when we get to the level where it's becoming a fundamental institution to solving the problem, and we have 4,000 law enforcement officials and 900 agencies using the tool, well, now we've shown its effectiveness, we've shown that it can be measured, we've shown that it can be improved, and at that point in time, I think it becomes incumbent upon the public sector to step up. We give our tools away for free. They're 100% free. I look at it like Facebook. We grow, 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 and at some point in time, we can turn on a revenue model that creates sustainability within our organization. So I think they're best incubated in the private sector, but at a certain point, the public sector needs to recognize that tool works, we need that tool, it's effective, and we can leverage it domestically and internationally to behoove everyone.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Massimino, let me ask you, your testimony noted a new provision in the bill that myself, Senator Rubio, and others have introduced that requires the multilateral development banks to conduct a human trafficking risk assessment for projects in Tier 2 watch list or Tier 3 countries as a condition of U.S. support. Now, it's my hope that these assessments can draw together a wide variety of stakeholders from international civil society organizations, local communities, law enforcement, and others, to ensure that development bank projects work to combat human trafficking wherever possible. I hope that as part of that, organizations such as yours would be called upon by the multilateral development banks. But it seems to me that we have done a few things here that are important, but we have a lot more tools at our disposition that we can use. And the multilateral development banks, having a strong tip report, thinking about how we incentivize the technology, either by allowing it to be free, as you suggested, in terms of its ability to go big, thinking about the privacy elements so that we ultimately don't constrain it in a way that is unnecessary, and maybe even looking at other countries and saying one of the ways in which we'll test whether or not you're moving in the right direction is, are you employing the latest available technologies that can help you? And so I appreciate what we've gleaned from both of your testimony and look forward to continuing to work with you. Do you have a comment?
I just want to underscore that I think, this provision that you've talked about with the requiring an assessment of implementation of anti-trafficking in order to, with the development banks, I think is just part of this, what we've been talking about, how you take the data and use it to leverage change. I completely agree with you, Senator, that we have a lot of tools that are not being fully used. to tackle this big problem. And a lot of what you all have done here has moved the ball forward between the federal acquisition regulations and the statute seeking to implement that, making sure that the changes to the Tariff Act get implemented. There's a lot that this body can do to take those tools and make sure that they're being fully exploited for good. And that takes a lot of attention. It sometimes takes money. But if we can pull this all together, I think that's the way that we're really going to make a dent in this problem.
Thank you, and I see my
Thank you.
helped me write the bill, and I appreciate his support alongside me.
Thank you both for being here, and I'm sure the chairman told you he had to go vote. He'll be back any minute now, but let me just start. I know you've talked about the integrity and the trafficking in persons report, and I don't know what's been discussed already, but one of the points I've made, this is always an issue when it comes to human rights, and that is the balance between our geopolitical relations and information about potential allies that is embarrassing. And I think you would both concur that, first of all, the Trafficking in Persons report, a lot of people think about it as just a piece of paper the U.S. government publishes, but it has in fact been impactful. Part of our role here is to shame those who are less than cooperative in the efforts to tackle this, including people here at home, but also governments abroad. And I just think I want to reiterate what appears already been discussed, how critical it is that this report be free from political interference. And to be blunt, the notion that someone could come in and say to the State Department, look, I don't want to change the tiering of a country because we've got a good thing going with them on some other foreign policy issue and we don't want to offend them. And it is my feeling that that occurred in the last report. That cannot happen again. And so our hope is to prevent that from happening. And I would imagine every advocate out there believes that as well. These issues are, especially since we as a nation are also hopefully being honest about our own internal problems with regards to that. And that, the first thing I want to talk about, Mr. Kutcher, is the Thorn website. And again, you may have talked about this already, it may have been asked, and I apologize, but the website talks about people using the internet to share child abuse material are doing so with seemingly low risk of getting caught. So I'm interested in learning how Thorn collaborates with law enforcement in the United States and around the world, especially with countries that have weak criminal justice systems, to change the sort of behavior with impunity of this criminal activity, and at the same time, using that also as a tool to hopefully train law enforcement agencies about victim-friendly procedures. There are places around the world, quite frankly, there have been jurisdictions in the United States that if, for example, someone is being trafficked into prostitution, they are arrested for the crime of prostitution and treated as a criminal as opposed to as a victim. And we've had arguments with law enforcement about that, some of whom argue to us that that's the appropriate way to do it, that's the only way to break them free from the endeavor. In other cases, I've had some disagreements with regards to that. But how is Thorn working to kind of end that cycle of impunity where people think we can do whatever we want, the chances of getting caught are very low, and quite frankly, the penalties in some places are not very high?
Thank you for the question. At its core, one of the issues with sex trafficking, and specifically domestically and most certainly internationally, is the lack of attention that it actually gets from law enforcement. Resources, I should say. Most trafficking divisions in police departments across this country are maybe 1 or 2 people, and they're understaffed and underfinanced. And so they really are when we first went in, we were looking at the tools that they were using, and they were going into chat rooms and trying to strike up conversations with traffickers or trafficking victims in order to get leads on investigation. So we saw, and specifically relative to minors, that if we could create a platform or a tool that helped them prioritize their caseload by understanding what we call a maturity score of the victim, we could help get the victims as early as possible out of the system, and as young as possible out of the system first. So we've created this prioritization tool. I'd be happy to show you Spotlight at some point in time. I don't want to reveal too much about it because I don't want to risk the enduring power of the platform. But we help them prioritize their caseload. And basically what we're doing is just taking this internet, which is largely anonymous in many ways, and making it far less anonymous. We can track victims as they get trafficked across state lines. We can we have investigation tools that allow us to understand the full picture, the full story of the trafficking victim over time and the trafficker over time, which is admissible in court, which is really good evidence in order to prosecute these cases.
And this question is for both of you. It's one of the things that you've heard a lot about, which I find to be one of the most grotesque and outrageous things I've seen, and that's the conduct of Backpage.com. There was a recent article in the Miami Herald that talked about a local organization that's filing a federal lawsuit against Backpage.com, and it found that in my hometown in Miami-Dade, over half the adult victims in human trafficking cases and 40% of minor victims were being advertised on Backpage.com. As you're probably aware, the Senate has also conducted an investigation with regards to that, an issue to report. So following that report, Backpage has closed the adult section in which advertisers solicited services. However, it's been reported that the ads are now running on the dating section, and some are now asserting, and I agree, that this is nothing more than a publicity stunt, and I would welcome both of you to comment on that change. And in the end, didn't they just change the name of the same activity?
So, you know, this has been happening long before Backpage. I think 6 years ago, I started going after the Village Voice for advertising sex on their platform. And actually, the way I went after them is I went after their advertisers and said, hey, do you know that this is happening? And the advertisers quickly pulled back, and the Village Voice had started to have some issues relative to that. I talked to the founder and the CEO of Backpage 5 years ago and said, we're watching, we know what's happening. I know you know what's happening. You can either join us in the fight against it, or you're going to become the tool for it. And they really sort of didn't want to hear about it. Craigslist, on the other hand, the founder, Craig Newmark, was very willing and interested in fighting this, and was actually distancing himself from what was happening on his platform. We technically watched the traffic move from the adult section to the women seeking men section. We watched it. We analytically watched it happen moments after it was shut down. Moments. So, you know, you look at it and you go, it's a game of whack-a-mole, right? And the only question that we have is, it's not relative to censoring it, it's not relative to shutting down the internet, it's relative to, can we build the tools that are better than their tools to fight what's happening? There are sites in the United States that do this other than Backpage, a lot of them, in fact. There are sites internationally that are doing this, that are other sites. It's happening all over the place. It's been happening for decades in print media. We're now just recognizing it for what it is, and I think that that's the most important part. And secondarily to that is let's build the tools, let's finance the tools, and let's deploy the tools to fight back.
So I think that Backpage has to be held accountable for what they're doing. And one of the things that they're doing right now, there's evidence that shows that they have been doctoring the ads, up to 80% of their ads, to conceal the underlying transaction, meaning that they are not, when they do that, they should not be protected by the law. You know, current law, and there's some good reasons for it, says that internet sites that allow third parties to post aren't responsible for the content of that post. But you don't have to change that law to go after what Backpage is doing right now. It appears that they are intentionally altering ads to make underage people look like they are consenting adults, and that is despicable and wrong, and they should be held accountable for that.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Before turning to Senator Coons, Jean Bader-Snyder is here. She's the lady sitting up front. She has been an operational leader here. She, years ago, in an airport in another country, saw a young lady that she thought was being trafficked. She went to talk to officials. She came back. She was gone, and it haunted her, and she's committed her life to dealing with this issue. So we thank you for that. We thank you for helping us be in the place that we are today, ready to launch what is happening. And to that, Senator Coons.
Senator Corker, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for taking the experiences that others have brought to you and applying your skills, your leadership, and your passion to mobilizing this committee, to engaging in a bipartisan way in legislation, to fighting tirelessly for funding, and to empowering organizations that have got the skills, the tools, the passion to now go out and make a difference. And I'm excited about the opportunity to continue working with you in this critical fight to end human slavery in the modern era. Thank you for your leadership on this, Chairman Corker. There's other great folks on this committee who've also been leaders on it, Senator Cardin, Senator Menendez, many others. As some of you may know, I've spent a lot of my time in Africa as a member of this committee, as the former chairman of the Africa Subcommittee. It is tragic what we know happens to people who are victims in this country and in countries around the world. So I mostly just want to thank you. Ashton Kutcher, thank you for your leadership and your innovation. I'm excited to see your tool and how it works and to better understand what Thorne is deploying here in the United States. And you've got some terrific people working with you, Julia and others who help make this real each and every day. And to Ms. Massimino, forgive me, and Human Rights First, thank you for also providing the analysis and the support. There are a lot of great organizations in this space. We need many, many more. The scope of this problem dwarfs the resources we currently have deployed against it. But you know, look, there are days here that are somewhat partisan and where it's somewhat frustrating and we don't get as much done as we'd like. This is a moment that is worth focusing on because it is a moment where we can recognize significant progress. I am the co-chair of the Law Enforcement Caucus, and given what I read in your testimony and what I've heard, I hope we have a chance to talk further about exactly how we get U.S. law enforcement better funded, better engaged, better equipped to deploy this tool and these resources, better trained. In my previous life, I was responsible for a county police force, and I'm confident that they don't have as much in the way of resources as they would need. And we were a county that was bisected by I-95, and where on a regular basis we had homeless and runaway kids, we had victims of domestic violence, and I'm certain of trafficking as well, and yet could have done much more with more resources. We had one officer who did what you're talking about, went into chat rooms, tried to gather evidence, tried to help pursue and prosecute child prostitution, child pornography cases. A very dedicated, very loyal, very skilled officer. There are a few more resources today, but still far below what it should be. So I just have 3 questions, if I might. First, I'm interested in how we can expand Thorne's model globally, because I think you've made a significant impact so far. But if you look at the level of resources and training and access in U.S. law enforcement, as we all know, in the developing world, law enforcement, courts, transparency are significantly less resourced. So I'd be interested in hearing how you think further investment by the United States government in the End Modern Slavery Initiative might inspire engagement from our private sector. And I think it is exciting, the digital partners and the information technology partners, Susan and others that you've brought to the table here. How might more investment in our appropriations leverage significant increased resources from the private sector? And then second, what are the limits to Spotlight internationally? What are the challenges you face in trying to really scale this up, but in countries where mobile technology is now widely available, but where the transparency, reliability of the law enforcement system is significantly below what we would hope and expect? And then just on a personal enthusiasm, a whole group of us worked together last year, Senators Flake and Menendez and Portman and Merkley, to pass the End Wildlife Trafficking Act. Wildlife trafficking is often viewed separately from human trafficking, but it's really not. And the criminal networks that benefit from wildlife trafficking, from killing and then selling parts, whether it's rhino horn or elephant tusk or pangolins or many others, are often exactly the same criminal networks that are involved in trafficking people. And so how could we reinforce those 2 efforts, which at times engage completely separate NGOs, but really with the same goal? Which is to end grotesque criminal activity that destroys and denigrates wildlife and whole communities and enslaves people. Ashton, to the first questions about how we might invest more and extend the reach.
Sure. We have 2 tools that I talked about today that are built, and several others that are built and already deployed. as I mentioned, the heavy lifting to a certain extent is done. The key to the ongoing success of the tools is continuing to iterate on those tools and make them better over time. Senator Rubio mentioned Backpage. They shut down one section of their site and another section pops up. These things become incumbent upon us having a malleable tool that can effectively work in all markets. But now that the database is built and the algorithm is built relative to understanding and the contextual understanding of this content, our expansion internationally is relatively simple in so much as we just need to find the environments that are being utilized for trafficking in those spaces and put them into our engine. Now, the trick, which you alluded to relative to the limits on that, is there are some countries where this platform probably won't work. But it's incumbent upon us to build the next tool that will work there. You know, a lot of this trafficking and the exchange, the advertisement of sex slavery, you know, happens online. In some sense, there's a benefit to that, right? Because in some ways it could be tracked. But building the tool relative to that specific market isn't trivial. We're currently working with international partners. Canada is using our Spotlight tool. We're talking to the UK about using our Spotlight tool. We think it'll be very effective in those markets. And our Solus dark web tool is being used in international spaces, I'll just say, by several people, and is proven to be very effective because the same dark web tool, Tor, which was created by the Naval Research Lab, is the same tool that's used internationally. So really just training our database to have an understanding of variable languages and things like that is fully doable. The limits, you know, the real limit is the fact that, you know, we're only sitting at the identification barrier, right? That is the limit. We can identify these people. I can identify all the people in the world, right? But if we don't have the right resources on the inbound side and on the outbound side, it's just going to be a cycle. And I think having a holistic understanding of the issue and approaching it from that perspective is essential to actually solving the problem. And relative to the wildlife piece, definitely on the dark web, our tool could be repurposed for specifically that. If somebody was so interested and passionate about that issue in the same way as I'm passionate about solving sex trafficking, well, our tool could essentially be repurposed for something like that if need be.
That's an intriguing conversation I'd love to follow up on, Ms. Massimino.
So I think the big picture issue here is around the risk-reward equation for, you know, how do you keep people from going into the business of exploiting others through slavery? And right now, you know, this is, as I said, a very low-risk enterprise for the bad guys and high reward. So how to flip that, you have to increase the risk. That includes through law enforcement, through reputational and other damage to companies that don't do a good job of getting rid of slavery in their supply chain, and decrease the reward. So we have to tackle both sides of that. And, you know, as you keep hearing, some of the pieces of this problem really can be solved or significantly advanced through increased resources. You know, so on the close to home kind of perspective, in the TVPA reauthorization, for example, it'd be really good to have designated human trafficking prosecutors. You know, there were only 297 of these prosecutions last year. If there were a provision that authorized human trafficking prosecutors in key U.S. Attorney's Office, I think that number would go up. And they could be responsible, kind of the hub, the point person for cultivating the relationships with all the different agencies that deal with this. We have seen jurisdictions with that type of collaboration increases their cases filed by 119%, and defendants charged up by 86%. So some of this really is a resource question. You know, I mentioned the federal acquisition regulations. Again, another, like the Tariff Act, potentially transformational change in the way we do business, we, the United States, do business. I think if we were to fully implement those regulations, we need to authorize human trafficking compliance advisors in the counsel's offices of all these agencies, state, DOD, labor, GSA, all of these places, who would work with the contracting officers and make sure that this is really being taken seriously. So there are lots of, there's a lot of potential here right now that's not being fully implemented. And with congressional oversight and attention on all of those, you all started a lot of that. Now to follow it through, making sure it's fully implemented, I think those could be transformational.
Well, Ms. Massimino, and Mr. Kutcher, to you and your organizations and everybody who supports them and volunteers with them, I'll just close by saying sexual slavery, human trafficking is some of the darkest activity that happens in the world. It thrives in dark places. It feeds on dark aspects of human nature. And I'm really grateful for your work, and Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in shining light on this problem and on bringing to all of us not just hope, but confidence that we can solve this. We can address this by appealing to the light within all of us and by coming together in a way that actually brings light to this darkest of subjects. Thank you for your work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your leadership on this issue and so many others. I know that we've got a meeting after this to build on this and look at some of the tools in private that are being utilized. But I want to thank you both for outstanding testimony, for committing your lives to this issue, for being examples, and bringing notoriety, bringing awareness, if you will, to this issue that plagues us all. There will be some follow-up questions. I know you've got a couple of day jobs, and you do too, but there may be some follow-up questions afterwards, and we'll try to keep those to a minimum, knowing that you've got other things that you do in life. But this has been an outstanding hearing. We apologize for, there's a lot happening up here on the Hill, as you know, and has been reported, and it's taken people in a lot of different directions right now, but this has been a very impactful hearing, and we look forward to building upon it. One of the things that I do wish we could have touched more on is I know you alluded to this, Ashton, but the sexual piece and the day labor piece, there are a lot of differences that exist too, and just some of the cultures that we deal with in other parts of the world, and the collection of passports. I know when we visit countries now, it's one of the first things that we bring up. I'm heading to that part of the world this weekend, but there are cultural aspects that are barriers, and people, again, unwittingly, think they're going to a country for a particular job for a period of time and end up being entrapped there. And so there may be some questions in that regard too, but again, the lives that you're leading and the example that you're setting for us, your willingness to come here and go right back to other work is deeply appreciated. I don't know if either one of you, this is a rather informal hearing, wish to say anything in closing, but you're welcome to if you wish.
I'd just like to say thank you. As I mentioned before, this is one of the greatest honors of my life. And I know the work that you all do is strife with conflict and headlines that dominate your time and pull you in directions that oftentimes you don't even want to go. But if we really care about ending slavery, if we really care about doing the right thing here, we'll realize that there will be negative repercussions of our actions. And I think the biggest thing that I got out of being here today, I got reminded of a story a friend of mine told me about a rabbi named Hillel, who was asked to explain the Torah while standing on one leg. And he said, "Love thy neighbor as thyself. Everything else is just commentary."
Lisa?
Thank you. Well, I also want to say thank you so much to you in particular, Mr. Chairman, who really have put this issue on the map in the United States Congress in a way that it has never been before. And now using that awareness, that growing awareness that we all have to end modern slavery. You know, I think it was Senator McCain who said this is not a pretty topic, and a lot of people, particularly Americans, don't like to think about it, don't want to talk about it, and would rather pretend that it doesn't exist. And particularly don't want to see the ways in which we're all complicit in this problem. So you have made that harder for people. And I want to thank you and all the members of the committee who have done so much to make people uncomfortable about this issue. And that's where it starts. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. You've been outstanding. We're going to walk across the hall, I think, and view how some of this that you have developed works so well. We thank you for that. The meeting is adjourned.